The morning mist clung to the rolling French countryside as Lieutenant James McKinley peered through his field glasses at the German-held village of Cantigny. It was May 28, 1918, and the air hung heavy with anticipation. This sleepy agricultural hamlet, perched atop a strategic ridge overlooking the surrounding terrain, had transformed into a fortified German stronghold. For the men of the 1st Division of the American Expeditionary Forces, the quiet dawn masked the gravity of what lay ahead, America's first independent offensive operation of the Great War. 5 minutes, Lieutenant, whispered Sergeant Frank Harris, checking his pocket watch nervously. McKinley nodded, his eyes never leaving the village silhouette. Around him, the doughboys of the 28th Infantry Regiment made final preparations, their faces set with determination despite the fear that gripped their hearts. They had trained extensively for this moment under the watchful eye of their commander, Major General Robert Lee Bullard, yet no amount of training could prepare them for what awaited beyond no man's land. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, the world erupted in chaos. Over 1,000 American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, sending a thunderous barrage onto the German positions. The ground shook violently as shells rained down on Cantigny, transforming the quaint village into an inferno of dust, smoke, and splintered timber. "My God," breathed Corporal Thomas Wilson, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never witnessed such destructive power. "The earth itself is being torn apart." Through the deafening roar, McKinley checked his watch. The artillery preparation would last exactly 60 minutes before the infantry would advance. He looked at the faces of his men, some veterans of previous engagements with French forces, others fresh-faced recruits who had never fired a shot in anger. "Remember your training," he shouted above the din, walking the line with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Keep your intervals, watch your flanks, and follow your officers." Behind the American lines, the 12 French Schneider tanks assigned to support the attack growled impatiently, their crews making final checks. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor represented the modern face of warfare, a complex symphony of destruction that the Americans were performing, for the first time on their own. As the barrage continued, Captain William Brown approached McKinley with updated intelligence. "Reports from aerial reconnaissance suggest the Germans have reinforced their second line," he said gravely. "We can expect heavy machine gun fire from the northeast edge of the village and from the woods beyond." This contextual information is drawn from the National Archives' 1st Division in France documents, which detail the meticulous planning of the Cantigny assault. The men of the 1st Division represented a cross-section of America: factory workers from Pennsylvania, farmers from the Midwest, clerks from New York, and ranchers from Texas. They were united now in purpose, if not background, all wearing the distinctive Big Red One patch that would soon become legendary on the Western Front. "Letters home, gentlemen," called out Chaplain Isaiah Montgomery, collecting final notes from soldiers who feared they might not survive the day. The ritual was solemn, each carefully folded paper containing words of love, regret, hope, and farewell. At 7:45, the artillery shifted to a rolling barrage designed to advance just ahead of the infantry. The tanks rumbled forward, followed by the first wave of American troops climbing out of their trenches with bayonets fixed. McKinley drew his pistol and blew his whistle. "Forward," he commanded, and the line of khaki-clad soldiers moved as one, advancing into the smoke-filled no-man's land toward Cantigny. The Battle of Cantigny, America's baptism of fire in the Great War, had begun. The wheat fields that had once flourished around Cantigny now lay flattened and scorched as the Americans advanced. Shell holes pockmarked the earth, providing momentary shelter for soldiers as German machine guns began their deadly chatter. The morning sun, now rising higher, cast long shadows across the battlefield, giving the surreal scene an almost theatrical quality. Private Michael O'Donnell dove into a crater as bullets kicked up dirt around him. Beside him, Private Henry Jefferson landed with a grunt, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Just like they said in training," Jefferson gasped, attempting humor despite the terror evident in his voice. "Walk forward until you meet resistance, then keep walking." O'Donnell nodded grimly. "Let's go then. Can't let the officers have all the glory." Together, They scrambled from the crater and rejoined the advancing line. The French tanks, though, slow and mechanically unreliable, provided crucial moving cover for the infantry. One tank, nicknamed Liberté by its crew, pushed directly toward a German strongpoint, drawing fire and allowing Captain Richard Donovan's company to flank the position. The coordination between armor and infantry, practiced extensively during training, was now being tested in combat. "Keep moving. Use the tanks for cover," Lieutenant McKinley shouted, waving his men forward as bullets zinged overhead. The carefully planned assault maintained its momentum, despite German resistance growing fiercer with each yard gained. As they approached the village outskirts, the true nature of the challenge revealed itself. Cantigny had been transformed into a fortress. Cellars had become bunkers connected by communication trenches. Machine gun nests were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, and snipers occupied the bell tower of the village church and other high points. According to historical accounts published in Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the American Expeditionary Forces, the German defenses at Cantigny represented some of the most sophisticated field fortifications seen on the Western Front. Major George Walker, commanding the 2nd Battalion, assessed the situation rapidly as his forces reached the first buildings. "Teams of 4, clear each structure, watch for traps." His commands, rehearsed countless times in training areas behind the lines, now guided his men through the deadly urban combat. The fighting became intimate and brutal. In one house, Sergeant Paul Martinez led a squad through a shattered doorway, only to face 3 German soldiers waiting with fixed bayonets. The ensuing struggle was swift and violent, ending with Martinez wounded but his team victorious. At the village center, the Americans encountered determined resistance around the church and cemetery. German machine gunners had established positions among the gravestones, while their snipers in the church tower picked off American officers identifiable by their insignia. "Target that tower," ordered Captain Donovan. A team with a Stokes mortar quickly set up, sending shells arcing toward the church. The third round found its mark, collapsing the upper portion of the tower in a cloud of stone dust and debris. 9:30 in the morning, elements of the 28th Infantry had fought their way through to the eastern edge of Cantigny, but the battle was far from over. German artillery, having identified the American breakthrough, began dropping shells on the village, killing attackers and defenders alike. In a partially collapsed farmhouse that had been converted to a command post, Colonel Hanson Ely received reports from his company commanders. "We've secured approximately 70% of the village," Major Walker reported, his uniform torn and bloodied. "But the Germans are massing for a counterattack from the northeast." Colonel Ely studied his maps, calculating how to best position his limited reserves. "We've come too far to lose our grip now," he said firmly. "Establish a defensive perimeter. This village belongs to the Big Red One now." As his officers departed to execute these orders, Ely radioed divisional headquarters. Cantigny largely in American hands, preparing to repel counterattack. The message, though brief, would soon be relayed to anxious commanders all the way, to General Pershing's headquarters, and eventually to Washington. America had seized its first objective on the Western Front, but holding it would prove even more challenging than taking it. By noon on May 28, 1918, Americans had achieved their primary objective. Cantigny was largely under their control, yet victory brought no respite. The men of the 1st Division worked feverishly to consolidate their positions, transforming the ruined village into a defensive stronghold. Soldiers with engineering experience supervised the conversion of shell craters into foxholes and the reinforcement of captured German dugouts. "Dig deeper, boys," Sergeant Harris urged as he moved among his platoon. "The Krauts will be back, and they'll bring everything they've got." The sergeant's prediction proved accurate sooner than anyone expected. At 12:45, German artillery began a systematic bombardment of Cantigny. Unlike the chaotic shelling of battle, this was a methodical, calculated barrage intended to soften the American positions before the inevitable counterattack. Lieutenant McKinley felt the earth shake as shells landed with increasing precision around his position in what had once been the village bakery. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling, while the remnants of display cases shattered under the concussive force. "Status report," he called to his radio operator, Private First Class Samuel Cooper. 3rd Platoon reports heavy casualties on the eastern perimeter, Cooper relayed, pressing the headset closer to his ear to hear over the bombardment. They're requesting reinforcements and additional machine gun ammunition. McKinley consulted his increasingly tattered map. Tell them to hold position. 2nd Platoon will deliver ammunition, but we have no reserves to send. The ferocity of the German response was documented in Colonel Ely's after-action report, where he noted that the enemy seemed determined to reclaim Cantigny regardless of cost, launching no fewer than 6 organized counterattacks within the first 24 hours. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the first German counterattack materialized through the smoke and dust. Waves of field gray uniforms advanced across the open ground northeast of the village. The Americans, though exhausted from their morning assault, met the attack with disciplined rifle fire. Machine gun teams positioned at strategic points under Captain Donovan's direction created deadly crossfire zones that cut down the advancing Germans. "Steady, men!" shouted Lieutenant Arthur Thompson as he moved among his riflemen. "Make every shot count." From his observation post, Major Walker watched the German attack falter under the combined fire of American rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Yet even as this first counterattack was repulsed, he could see additional German forces gathering for another attempt. "They're probing for weaknesses," he reported to Colonel Ely. "This is just the beginning." Indeed, throughout the afternoon and into the evening, the Germans launched a series of increasingly determined assaults. Each attack was met with fierce resistance, but gradually the Americans' ammunition began to run low, and casualties mounted. The evacuation of wounded became increasingly difficult as German artillery targeted the routes back to American lines. Private O'Donnell found himself helping in a makeshift aid station established in the village church basement. The stone walls provided some protection from shelling, but the scene inside was harrowing. Stretchers bearing wounded men arrived continuously, while medical personnel worked desperately to stabilize them for evacuation. "Water," gasped a young soldier with a chest wound. O'Donnell held a canteen to the man's lips, recognizing him as Jefferson, his companion from the morning advance. "Hang on, Jefferson," he said with forced optimism. "The docs will have you patched up and writing home about this by tomorrow." Jefferson managed a weak smile before a medic moved O'Donnell aside to continue treatment. As darkness fell, the intensity of combat did not diminish. German flares illuminated the battlefield with an eerie light, turning night into ghostly day as they launched their 4th major counterattack. This assault penetrated the American lines at several points, resulting in vicious hand-to-hand fighting in the village streets. Colonel Ely, receiving reports of breakthroughs, committed his final reserves. A single company held back for this eventuality. "Push them back," he ordered Captain James Lawton. "Whatever it takes." The night battle among the ruins of Cantigny reached a level of ferocity that veterans would later struggle to describe. Rifle butts, bayonets, entrenching tools, and even bare fists became weapons as the opposing forces grappled for control of the strategic village. By midnight, the Americans had restored their lines, but at terrible cost. In the brief lulls between German attacks, the defenders worked to redistribute ammunition, treat wounded, and reinforce vulnerable sections of their perimeter. Few had eaten since before dawn, and water was in critically short supply. "How are we holding up?" Lieutenant McKinley asked Sergeant Harris as they met briefly near the village square. Harris gestured to the exhausted men around them. "They're running on nothing but guts and determination now, sir. But they won't give up this ground. Not after what it cost to take it." McKinley nodded grimly. Dawn was still hours away, and intelligence suggested the Germans were preparing their largest counterattack yet. The pre-dawn hours of May 29th found the American defenders of Cantigny in a precarious state. Nearly a third of the original attacking force had become casualties. Ammunition reserves were critically low, and every man showed signs of extreme exhaustion. Yet as gray light began to outline the ruined buildings, a different kind of tension replaced the night's nervous vigilance. "They're coming again," announced Private Cooper, who had spent the night monitoring radio traffic. "Regiment reports large enemy formations assembling to our north and east." Lieutenant McKinley acknowledged the information with a nod. His once crisp uniform was now torn and filthy, his face blackened with powder residue except for clean streaks where sweat had cut through the grime. "Pass the word," he ordered. "Fix bayonets. Conserve ammunition. Wait for my signal to fire." Along the American perimeter, the remaining officers and non-commissioned officers moved quietly among their men, repeating these instructions and offering encouragement. Despite their desperate situation, discipline held. At 6:15 in the morning, the largest German counterattack yet began with a massive artillery barrage that seemed to transform the very air into steel and fire. When the barrage lifted, 3 battalions of German stormtroops advanced on Cantigny. "Hold fire until they're within 200 yards, Major Walker commanded through his messengers. This order, born of necessity due to ammunition shortages, required iron discipline from the defenders as they watched the enemy approach unchallenged. General Pershing's official communiqué about the battle emphasized this phase of the fighting. The men of the 1st Division exhibited extraordinary courage and tactical discipline in the face of overwhelming enemy pressure, demonstrating the finest qualities of the American soldier. When the order finally came to open fire, the effect was devastating. The concentrated American fire tore through the German ranks at close range, yet the attackers pressed forward with determination born of their own desperation. German High Command had ordered Cantigny retaken at all costs. Untold. The northeastern sector, the German assault breached the American lines. Captain Donovan, seeing the breakthrough, gathered every available man, cooks, messengers, walking wounded, and led a desperate counterattack. "For America!" he shouted, leading the charge with pistol drawn. The impromptu force collided, with the advancing Germans in a chaotic melee of bayonets, rifle butts, and grenades. Private O'Donnell found himself in the thick of this fighting, his rifle ammunition exhausted, defending himself with his bayonet against a German soldier twice his size. A desperate thrust found its mark, and as his opponent fell, O'Donnell quickly claimed the man's stick grenades, using them to drive back other attackers. By 8:30 in the morning, this German attack too had been repulsed, but the Americans' situation had grown even more tenuous. In his command post, Colonel Ely received increasingly urgent reports of ammunition shortages and mounting casualties. "Sir, Company E is down to less than 50 effective men," reported a dust-covered lieutenant. "They cannot hold if hit again in force." Ely studied his maps, looking for options that simply weren't there. The planned relief by fresh troops had been delayed by the intensity of German artillery fire on the approach routes. "Tell Captain Lawrence to consolidate what's left of E and G companies," he finally ordered. "We hold until relieved. Those are my only orders." Throughout that second day, the Germans launched 3 more major attacks and numerous smaller probing actions. Each was repulsed, but the cost in American lives climbed steadily. By late afternoon, many defenders were reduced to fighting with captured German weapons and ammunition. The situation reached its most critical point around 4 o'clock, when German flamethrower teams advanced behind improvised shields, targeting American strongpoints. The terrifying weapons brought a new dimension of horror to the battle. "Fall back to the secondary positions," shouted Sergeant Harris as jets of liquid fire engulfed the forward foxholes. The orderly withdrawal saved many lives, but conceded precious ground within the village. Lieutenant McKinley, organizing the defense of the new line, spotted German infantry advancing to exploit the breakthrough. With no time to organize a proper response, he grabbed a Chauchet automatic rifle from a fallen soldier and provided covering fire himself, allowing his men to establish new firing positions. "Lieutenant's hit," called Private Cooper as McKinley suddenly spun and fell, a German bullet finding its mark. Medics rushed forward, dragging the wounded officer to shelter, while the line held precariously. As evening approached on May 29th, the Americans in Cantigny had been fighting continuously for over 36 hours. Many had not slept for days, including their preparation time before the attack. Yet when Colonel Ely visited the lines, he found determination rather than defeat in the eyes of his men. "Relief is coming," he assured them, having finally received confirmation that fresh troops were moving forward to replace them. Just a few more hours. As darkness fell once more on the shattered village, the Germans prepared for what would be their final major effort to recapture Cantigny. The night of May 29th to the 30th brought no respite for the defenders of Cantigny. German artillery continued its methodical bombardment, while snipers and raiding parties probed the American lines continuously, preventing any real rest for the exhausted men. The promised relief had been delayed again by heavy enemy fire on the approach routes. In a cellar that now served as both command post and aid station, Major Walker received the latest casualty figures from his medical officer, Captain Howard. "Grant, we've lost nearly 60% of our original force," Grant reported grimly. "Another third of the remaining men are walking wounded, fighting with injuries that would normally have them evacuated." Walker absorbed this information in silence before asking, "Ammunition?" "Critical across all units," responded his supply officer. "Most men are down to their last magazine, if that. We've distributed all captured German weapons and ammunition, but it won't be enough if they come in force again." The major studied the haggard faces of his staff. Like him, none had slept in days, and all bore the signs of the intense combat they had endured. Yet there was no question of surrender. They would hold Cantigny or die in its ruins. "We've got one advantage," Walker finally said. "Every hour we hold is another hour for our relief to get here. The Germans know this too. They'll hit us with everything at dawn." Dawn on May 30th came with an eerie silence. The customary artillery barrage did not materialize, leaving the defenders in an anxious state of anticipation. Sergeant Harris, now commanding what remained of his platoon after Lieutenant McKinley's wounding, moved along his section of the line, checking on his men. "I don't like this quiet," muttered Corporal Wilson, the Nebraska farm boy whose youthful face now looked decades older. "What are they planning?" "Stay alert," Harris replied. "They're hoping we'll relax, maybe catch some sleep." The answer came. At 6:45, when observers reported massive enemy formations assembling beyond the eastern edge of the village. Unlike previous attacks, this one would be led by specialist Sturmabteilung troops, German stormtroopers trained in infiltration tactics. Historical records from the 1st Division at War document indicate that this final German counterattack involved elements of 3 different divisions, representing the German High Command's determination to erase the American success at Cantigny before it could become a propaganda victory. Colonel Ely, receiving these reports, made his final dispositions. "Pull everyone back to the central defensive line," he ordered. "Abandon the outskirts. We don't have the men to hold them anyway. Concentrate what firepower we have at the choke points." This tactical withdrawal was completed just as the German artillery finally opened up, the most intense bombardment yet. For 20 minutes, the village seemed to disappear in explosions as shells of all calibers rained down. When the barrage lifted, the German stormtroops attacked not in waves but in small, fast-moving groups, exploiting every bit of cover. "Here they come," shouted Captain Donovan as the first German troops appeared, rushing from building to building. The American defenders held their fire until targets presented themselves, making every precious round count. Private O'Donnell, now part of a 3-man machine gun team after his rifle jammed permanently, helped feed the belt as their gunner. Private Ryan McAllister swept the approaching Germans with carefully controlled bursts. Their position, covering the main street, became a priority target, drawing intense enemy fire. "Grenade!" warned the 3rd member of their team, Private George Takahashi. The 3 men dove for cover as the German stick grenade exploded, showering them with debris but causing no serious injuries. Before the dust had settled, they were back at their gun, engaging the next wave of attackers. Across the village, similar desperate struggles unfolded as the outnumbered Americans fought to hold their positions. In some sectors, the fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat once again as German troops penetrated the defensive perimeter. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the situation had become critical. Several key strongpoints had fallen, ammunition was virtually exhausted, and the remaining defenders were being pushed back toward the village center. "Sir, we can't hold much longer," Major Walker reported to Colonel Ely. "Company A is down to 12 effective men. B Company has been overrun." Ely, who had remained outwardly calm throughout the battle, showed his first signs of strain. "No retreat," he insisted. "We hold the center of the village at all costs. Every minute we buy is crucial." As if to punctuate his words, the radio suddenly crackled to life. "Overlord to Bastion," came the coded message. "Relief force has broken through. ETA your position 30 minutes. Acknowledge." The radio man confirmed receipt while Colonel Ely permitted himself a brief smile. 30 minutes, gentlemen. We need to hold for just 30 more minutes." The news spread quickly among the remaining defenders, providing a final reserve of determination. Sergeant Harris, hearing the news as he helped repel yet another German assault on his position, rallied his exhausted men. "Half an hour, boys. Reinforcements are half an hour away. Make every shot count." The Germans, perhaps sensing the impending arrival of American reinforcements, pressed their attack with renewed fury. In the northwestern sector, a determined enemy push broke through to the village square, threatening to split the American defense in two. Colonel Ely, seeing this development, made a decision that would later enter 1st Division lore. "Follow me," he ordered his headquarters staff, leading them personally into the fight with pistols and rifles. This impromptu counterattack, led by the regimental commander himself, momentarily stabilized the situation. At 10:15 in the morning, the vanguard of the American Relief Force, fresh troops from the 26th Infantry Regiment, finally reached the outskirts of Cantigny. Their arrival coincided with the beginning of a massive American artillery barrage targeting the German positions around the village. For the battered defenders, the sight of fresh American troops advancing in good order was nearly overwhelming. Private O'Donnell, his machine gun now empty and useless, watched through exhausted eyes as the reinforcements moved efficiently through the ruins he and his comrades had defended for nearly 3 days. "We did it," he whispered, slumping against a shattered wall. "We actually held." By nightfall on May 30th, 1918, the Battle of Cantigny had officially ended. The relief force had completely secured the village and established a new defensive perimeter well beyond its boundaries. The Germans, after suffering severe casualties in their repeated counterattacks, finally conceded the American victory and withdrew to their secondary positions. For the men of the 28th Infantry who had borne the brunt of the fighting, the end came not with celebration, but with a bone-deep exhaustion that transcended physical fatigue. As they were relieved and began the trek back to the rear areas, many moved in a daze, scarcely believing they had survived. "Form up, men," Sergeant Harris called, his voice hoarse from 3 days of shouting orders above the din of battle. Before him stood the remnants of what had been a full-strength platoon, now reduced to 17 muddy, blood-stained soldiers who leaned on each other for support. Medical teams worked tirelessly, evacuating the wounded who had accumulated in aid stations throughout the village. Among them was Lieutenant McKinley, his shoulder heavily bandaged but his eyes alert as he insisted on walking rather than being carried on a stretcher. "Someone more badly wounded can use it," he told the frustrated medic. "I can still walk." As the surviving officers gathered for a final briefing with Colonel Ely, the true cost of the battle became clear. Of the over 3,000 men who had attacked Cantigny on May 28th, more than 900 had become casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Yet in military terms, the objective had been achieved and held against determined enemy counterattacks. "Gentlemen," Ely addressed his officers, his own exhaustion evident in his bearing, "what you and your men accomplished here will not be forgotten. You have proven that American soldiers can stand against the best the enemy has to offer, and prevail." The New York Times would later publish a front-page account of the battle, declaring, "American troops capture Cantigny. First independent action by General Pershing's men results in success." This public acknowledgement of the victory provided a much-needed morale boost to the American public after a year of war with few visible results. As June dawned, the survivors of Cantigny found themselves the object of attention from senior commanders and war correspondents alike. General Pershing himself visited to decorate those who had distinguished themselves, including Colonel Ely, who received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the battle. Private O'Donnell, recovering in a field hospital alongside hundreds of other Cantigny veterans, was surprised to find himself visited by a correspondent from Stars and Stripes. "Tell me about your experience," the reporter urged, pencil poised over notebook. O'Donnell hesitated, searching for words that could possibly convey the reality of what he had witnessed. "We did our job," he finally said. "That's all. We did what we were sent there to do." This simple statement, when published, captured the emerging ethos of the American Expeditionary Forces better than any florid prose could have done. For the military leaders, Cantigny provided valuable lessons that would inform subsequent operations. The coordination of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft had been imperfect but promising. The ability of American troops to hold captured ground against determined counterattacks had answered questions about their combat effectiveness. 2 weeks after the battle, Major General Bullard, commander of the 2nd Brigade, gathered officers for an assessment. "Cantigny was the opening act," he told them frankly. "Larger operations are coming. We must learn from both our successes and failures." Captain Donovan, promoted to major following the battle, pointed to a map of the Western Front. "The men have confidence now," he observed. "They know they can take objectives and hold them. That's worth more than any tactical lesson." For the individual soldiers who had fought at Cantigny, the experience transformed them in ways that would only become fully apparent in the years and decades that followed. Many who survived would go on to fight in the larger American offensives. Later, in 1918, at Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, and in the massive Meuse-Argonne campaign, Sergeant Harris, visiting wounded men from his platoon in the hospital, found Private Wilson staring silently out a window, his arm in a sling. "Are you holding up?" Harris asked gently. Wilson turned, his expression thoughtful rather than traumatized. "You know what's strange, Sarge? When I joined up, I was afraid I wouldn't be brave enough when the time came. Now I know." "And were you?" Harris asked. "That's just it," Wilson replied. "When it happened, there wasn't time to be brave or scared. You just did what needed doing because your buddies were counting on you. I think maybe that's what courage really is. This wisdom, earned in the crucible of Cantigny, would be the most enduring legacy of America's first battle in the Great War." The ground they captured was strategically modest, a small village on a minor front, but its symbolic importance was immeasurable. At Cantigny, the American Expeditionary Forces announced their arrival on the Western Front not with words but with deeds. In the decades that followed, Cantigny would be overshadowed by the larger battles that came later in 1918. Yet for the men who fought there, and for the 1st Division, the Big Red One, it remained a point of pride and a touchstone of their identity. When the American Battle Monuments Commission established its memorials after the war, Cantigny earned its place in the official history. The citation read simply, "Here the 1st Division, United States Army, beginning on May 28, 1918, captured and held Cantigny, the first American offensive of the World War." For Lieutenant James McKinley, Sergeant Frank, Harris, Private Michael O'Donnell, and thousands of their comrades, these formal words could never capture what they had experienced in those 3 desperate days. But as they returned to civilian life in the years that followed, they carried with them the knowledge that when tested in the fire of combat, they and their nation had proven equal to the challenge. The legacy of Cantigny thus became part of America's military heritage, not merely as a tactical victory, but as a demonstration of the courage, determination, and sacrifice that would ultimately help turn the tide of the Great War.